Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Simmonds. I'm the Member of Parliament for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and I'm the Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Migration and Refugees. We're going to have an opportunity with a fairly tight schedule this afternoon to hear about the issue of refugee integration with some perspectives in particular from high-income countries, in line really with what the UK has been talking about as a new points-based migration system, but also relevant to the debate around the right to work for people who come to this country as migrants and as asylum seekers, and how that process should be managed, which there's been a good deal of parliamentary debate about. So our panel, we start with two experts who are going to talk a little bit about the report that they have authored, Dr. Carlos Vargas-Silva and Dr. Isabel Ruiz. After we've heard from them, introducing their report and talking about their research, we'll hear from Richard Fuller, who is one of my parliamentary colleagues. He is the Member of Parliament for North East Bedfordshire and has taken a real interest in the way that migration issues develop. And I know also has quite a lot of local knowledge connected to the deportation system, so how migration control operates in the UK and the impact that that has on a local community. We'll then hear from Hannah Gregory. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Hannah, who's here from the Home Office. She is the Deputy Director who deals with integration and community sponsorship. Again, topics of a lot of public debate, but also great interest to NGOs. And then we're going to hear from Fuad Mahamed, who is the CEO of the Ashley Community Housing Organisation, who I'm hoping is going to give us a bit of a kind of ground level presentation about how integration is working in practice and share his experiences. So that's our panel. And at the end of that, once we've heard them, there'll be time for some questions and answers and some discussion. And we're going to keep very strictly to the clock because I know colleagues have to be away for other events that are taking place at 5 p.m. So our first speakers, Dr. Carlos Vargas-Silva and Dr. Isabel Ruiz, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, David. Let me share my screens because we want to present some slides. Perfect. Now it works. Sorry for the delay on that. I was saying that thank you for the opportunity to present this work, and that this is part of a research agenda on refugees that I have been working with Isabel for the last few years. So there are many questions related to refugees. For instance, there's a question of what number of refugees to accept, who should be given protection, and many other very important questions. The one that we address in our research is how do we facilitate the integration of refugees, and in particular, our focus is integration into the labor market. Now, you might ask, why is that important? And in this figure, that red line next to the zero line represents the people born in the UK, and the solid black line represents the employment rate of refugees, in particular the difference with the employment rate of people born in the UK. You can see that during the first 5 years of residence, refugees have an employment rate which is less than 35 percentage points than similar people born in the UK. This is people living in the same local authority, with the same gender, with the same level of education. Over time, that difference decreases. After 10 years, it's a bit more than 10 percentage points. After 15 years, it's 2 or 3 percentage points. So over time, things do get better for refugees, but it takes about 15 years for us to get to that point. So part of the purpose of our report is to look for possibilities, for policies that can help close that gap faster than at the moment. And what we did was to look at lessons from other high-income countries, and we selected high-income countries in order to have a context which is as comparable as possible to the context of the UK, and see what works for integrating refugees into a labor market. Of course, we are aware that even in other high-income countries, there's no country like the UK or like the UK economy, so nothing is perfectly, it's not possible to translate everything into the UK context, but things can be adjusted and policies can be adjusted to this context. And in particular, Our focus was on policies that have been evaluated, but what we think are rigorous methodologies. There are many good ideas, many which actually could have an impact on refugee integration into a labor market, but we are focusing on the ones that have been evaluated and are leaving other ones. It doesn't matter, this is not saying that those other policies are not important or relevant, it's just that there's no evidence at the moment to test those policies. And obviously you can see more details about this technical part in the report and the publications that we cite. Now I'm going to pass the presentation to Isabel, who is going to be presenting the main findings of the report.
Thank you. So as Carlos mentioned, and if you remember that graph where it takes a long time for refugees' labor market outcome to catch up with those of the natives and even other migrants, we wanted to look at policies and interventions related to earlier arrival, when the refugees arrive, that had been properly evaluated, that had some sort of way of methodologically assessing causal impact of the policy or intervention on those labor market outcomes of refugees. So we looked at the asylum process. We looked specifically at waiting times, the times to receive a decision on refugee status, and location, dispersal location. We looked at job search assistance, language training, and changes in social assistance. And what we're going to do now is just going to give you some insights from each of these aspects, and we tell you a bit of some of the work that we found in there. So in terms of the asylum process, when it comes to waiting times, the first insight that we brought in this report is that reducing waiting times for a decision can actually have a major positive impact on the long-term employment outcomes of refugees. And in here, we cite evidence from a paper for Switzerland, in which the authors find that an additional year of waiting time reduces subsequent employment rate of refugees by 4 to 5 percentage points. This paper is quite interesting because they also try to understand different underlying mechanisms of what may be taking place in here, and they find that there might be psychological discouragement. This waiting time, this idle time, may have a psychological impact or discouragement on the well-being of refugees. The second insight comes from looking at the literature on dispersal accommodation. And in here, most of the evidence that we looked at is quite mixed, and is related to dispersal location and proximity to co-ed networks. And it is mixed because you could think about being closer to co-ed networks can have a positive impact in the sense that you get more access to information and therefore to opportunities of employment. But on the other hand, it can detract you from acquiring country-specific human capital. But what we wanted to highlight in here as an insight is a new direction on this research, which has been trying to think how to strategically match refugees with locations. And in here, one example comes from a paper by one of our colleagues here at Oxford, which works on some modeling using machine learning to do strategic placement of refugees. They look specifically at the US, and they find with their strategic matching that this displacement could actually increase employment outcomes by up to 38%. And they've been working with organizations in the US to try to implement this strategic matching. Our third insight comes from the job search strategies. And in here, one of the things that we have found in the past in the UK is that refugees tend to rely a lot on public agencies to try to find a job. Sometimes this is not necessarily the best way to find a job, or is not that effective. And we're trying to look at what's being done out there. And the insight here is that bespoke job search assistance can actually improve the labor market outcomes of refugees. And we're here citing evidence from Sweden that suggests that intensive job market coaching can increase the employment rate of refugees by 6 percentage points. In this work for Sweden, they work with the Public Employment Service, and the caseload agents were given reductions so that they could dedicate more time to the refugees. That moves us into language. And one would think that this is an obvious one, right? Language training and access to language courses is going to improve the economic outcomes of refugees. We actually found some papers that show evidence that that's the case, but also that additional training can have an even more significant impact. And there's evidence from France here suggesting that an additional 100 hours of language training increases the likelihood of participating in the labor force between 15 to 27 percentage points, which is quite substantial. And we're going to finish with access to welfare. And this comes from a study in Denmark, in which the authors look at the impacts of lowering welfare payments. And they find that in the short term, lowering these welfare payments can incentivize labor force participation of refugees. So they do find that in the short term, there's a positive impact on employment rates, but in the long term can have negative consequences. This evidence from Denmark suggests that this welfare reform led to substantial increases in, for example, crime participation among refugees. This is mainly related to property crime and shoplifting. So now with these 5 insights in mind, Carlos is going to talk about some recommendations that we put forth in the briefing.
Thank you, Isabel. So in addition to the policies and these potential policies, there are some other recommendations that we are including in the report. Importantly, for us, it's very important to conduct and publish evaluations of programs related to refugees. These formal evaluations are the main way to know what works and what doesn't work. So we encourage those who are working with refugees to evaluate these programs and to actually publish these findings so others can take a look and know what works in the UK context. Another situation or limitation for research on refugees is obviously data collection. The last longitudinal effort to collect data in the UK on refugees took place over a decade ago. Longitudinal data is very important because we want to follow people over time and see how do they integrate into British society, and in our particular case, the UK labour market. This could be also take place as adding additional questions in different data sets and surveys about refugee status, even at the moment or at some previous point. Also, what kind of refugee status the person had, whether it was a resettled person or a different route related to asylum. And finally, the use of administrative data can provide a way of doing many of these things constantly and in a longitudinal way. Potentially can be a less costly effort, but it will require coordination, obviously, between different departments. With that in mind, we are going to stop here because we have several great speakers in the panel. Just to leave you with the links to the report, to the Econ Force page, which is the Economics of Forced Migration. It's a page in which we are putting our research on this topic. And there you have our emails. If anyone wants to get in touch or you're doing research on this or have any questions, please do get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlos and Isabel. Very interesting. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Richard as our next speaker. He is one of Parliament's leading experts, in particular in the field of financial services, which we know is a big income earner for the United Kingdom, an area where there's enormous demand internationally for securing the right people, the right workforce to be part of that. And clearly, very much a relevant connection when we think about the ultimate destinations, the aspirations that people may have. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, David. Hopefully I'm expert enough not to have myself on mute, and I really pretty cool. Thank you very much, David. Carlos, Isabel, thank you very much for your report and for stimulating our discussion. I'm going to make some inexpert comments, but just by way of background, Forgive me for perhaps not being so expert on definition. Most of my involvement in immigration has come from a sentiment about the utter inefficiency and waste of the immigration detention estate, which focuses largely on removals, and through that to the asylum process. And I'm not sure if it's in scope to talk about that, but obviously those are adjacent to but different from the specific issues that you looked at in your report regarding refugees. But I just want to make two broad contextual comments. The first is post-COVID world of employment is substantially different from the pre-COVID world of employment for everyone. And as we have found in the past, that when times are more difficult for people, difference becomes sharper, and people's willingness to accept difference becomes less as people focus on their job, their employment, their income, their family. And I think that's an interesting context as you look at some of your data about, well, what do we see as which has largely covered a period of sustained growth, even through the great moderation after the recession, the financial crisis. What does it mean if we do face a recovery from a 10% decline in GDP? And the second is the reform of the asylum process, which is, I wouldn't say much vaunted, but I think much anticipated from the government. And the reason I mention that is that my own observation is that many of the issues, particularly about barriers for people to go into work, could be resolved, certainly for asylum seekers, by a reformed process. I mean, people who come here under either of those approaches, either as a refugee or as an asylum seeker, will bring with them barriers to employment, whether in this country or any other country. And an effective, efficient immigration system should, in that process of initial engagement, be absolutely focused on removing those barriers to participation, whether they're psychological, social, or legal. And I sincerely hope, and I know we'll be hearing from Hannah, she probably won't be able to comment on it, but just to put the message, I really do think we need to look at that front end of resources and how we focus resources. Because what we really want is an effective system, not a fast and furious system. One of the great things about the United Kingdom is its labour markets. We have a much more flexible labour market, lots of different ways that people can get into the labour market here, far less defensive systems that preclude people from getting in because they don't have the right qualifications, and a much easier transition for people up many, although not all, of the rungs of the labour market. But we have a diverse demographic background that enables people to find locations where there may already be people who have greater affinity to help people into employment. And contrary to your views on the benefit system, which I think were fairly, as in appropriately, balanced, I do think the benefit system, the changes that have occurred in the benefit system over the last 10 years, actually have worked to help that positive engagement with getting into employment. So where are we falling short? Well, the record of dispersion of people across the UK hasn't seemed to me to be appropriately garnered to where employment opportunities lie. So again, I'm using asylum seeker information rather than refugees. The dispersion of asylum seekers is largely in those areas which have higher proportions of unemployment. So 9,000, I think the latest statistics I had, David, were from September of last year, 9,734 asylum seekers in the Northwest, just 603 in the Southeast, 4,076 in the Northeast, just 752 in my own region of East Anglia. And I think as we think about dispersion, we really ought to be thinking about where is the greatest opportunity for dispersion in terms of getting people into work, and what are the barriers, the powers that, the balance of powers between local authorities and the centre in managing that, that distribution. I would finally say that on the decision time, this seems to me to be the clearest message that I read from the report that we've seen today. And it is coherent with, I think, the direction of travel of the government. But I would just say that going through a process in a short period of time is only as good as the resources you put into that short period of time. And I would hope to hear, both hopefully from Hannah or perhaps later, what it is from the government's point of view as they think about making the system more streamlined, they're going to do in terms of making it more effective?
Thank you, Richard. That was a really, really helpful intervention. I think particularly as we go into the debate about both safe and legal routes and also the new immigration system, the point being made by many colleagues across the House, which Richard has just talked us through, about the efficiency of the borders operation and the way that we deal with this quickly, which very much is reflected in the research, is central, I think, to the thinking of a lot of parliamentarians. Right, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Hannah Gregory. Hannah, as you know, is from the Home Office. I think it's probably best if I let her introduce herself, but we're very grateful that you're here with us at the APPG this afternoon. Hannah, over to you.
You're still on mute.
There we go. It had to be one of us, didn't it? Right, let me start again then. So thank you, David, and thank you, Carlos and Isabel, for this work, and thank you, Richard, for those comments as well. Carlos and Isabel, you know, we have drawn heavily on previous work of yours to inform our approach to refugee integration, and we look forward to building on these further insights. So I'm the head of the Home Office's Refugee Integration Unit. And since our inception in 2017, empowering refugees in the UK to rebuild their lives, thrive and give back to the UK has been part of a really shared agenda. You know, we have sought to build the evidence base for what works in order to both influence mainstream service delivery and to identify the more bespoke support refugees may require. This government is absolutely focused on securing better outcomes for refugees welcome to the UK, particularly focusing on labour market access. And this is going to be central to the Home Secretary's commitment to overall our approach to asylum and illegal migration, delivering a firm but fair asylum system. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into lots of detail about what those reforms are going to look like, but I can assure you that there's going to be a lot of opportunity in the coming months to discuss and get into the detail of some of those. So I'm going to just reflect a bit on the different recommendations in the report. The first two recommendations from the report focus on the asylum system, faster decision making and the strategic dispersal of asylum seekers. You know, I think we can all agree that waiting months for a decision is in nobody's best interest, and part of the reason why reform to the system is so needed. And I think part of a reform system is, as Richard says, not just about a faster system, but a system which provides better information to people so that the stress that you can feel kind of going through the system is as mitigated as far as is possible. In terms of strategic dispersal, the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Programme has actually shown us the benefits to having as broad a range of areas as possible welcoming refugees, you know, from Scottish Islands to city centres. Different places offer different kinds of support, but we will consider the evidence contained in the report about how other countries have approached the matching of skills with places as we continue to develop our approach. The next three recommendations cover bespoke employment support, language training and welfare payments, and I'm going to address these recommendations together. So refugees in the UK have access to mainstream benefits, as you'll know, and services to enable their integration. And part of our focus over the past number of years has been working across government to ensure that mainstream service delivery better understands and meets the needs of refugees. But we also really agree that providing bespoke, individualised employment support to refugees has got to be at the heart of any approach to refugee integration. We provided early seed funding to World Jewish Relief to test a model of employment support with a focus on the individual and also on building partnerships with DWP and employers. We've also co-funded a refugee entrepreneurship programme with the National Lottery Community Foundation through the Centre for Entrepreneurs. We've drawn on evidence from the rollout of these programmes and other employment initiatives to make the case for greater investment in refugee employment. You know, upfront investment, which is better for the individual and better for the UK. And we were really excited to be successful in a funding bid to HM Treasury for a Refugee Transitions Outcomes Fund. that's going to pilot this holistic model of refugee integration in a number of areas in England, recognise the importance of understanding the local authority perspective and the local dynamics. Carlos and Isabel, I think, will also be pleased to hear that evaluation is built into the fabric of the programme. We're going to be announcing more details of this fund shortly, but we are really excited about it. It's a joint programme with DWP, and the role of the Department for Work and Pensions can't be underestimated here. There is a real commitment in DWP to understanding the needs of refugees and adapting their approach to meet these needs. For example, in the development of refugee-specific sector work academy programmes. I was on a call with DWP Job Centre staff last week to talk about supporting refugees into employment, and there were almost 4,000 people on the call, which I think is testament in itself to the commitment and interest in this agenda amongst DWP colleagues. I think it's really important to reflect on the role of business and employers. And we have worked to raise awareness of the benefits to business of employing refugees, supporting the publication of the Tapping Potential guidelines. I'll put a link onto them later. And also funding the Refugee Employment Network to connect organisations supporting refugees into work, employers and a range of other partners. So moving on then to language training. The Department for Education does fund, as many of you all know, English for speakers of other languages through the adult education budget. Refugees are eligible for full funding for ESOL if they are unemployed and looking for work. However, we recognise that ESOL doesn't always meet the needs of refugees and that additional support is often required. We have launched, via the Education and Training Foundation, online resources to support English language teachers working with refugees who arrive with the lowest levels of English language. And we provide additional funding for resettled refugees to access additional English language provision, together with funding for childcare support to take away some of the barriers that women in particular face in accessing English language provision. And I want to finish by talking about cross-sector partnerships, which we believe are really fundamental to refugee integration. In your introduction to the report, David, you talk about the importance of partnerships, and I couldn't agree more. It's a whole of society approach, and that's been at the core of our work on refugee integration. There is, of course, a very important role for government, both national, also really critically local, also for NGOs, for business, and for communities themselves. This approach has been informed by our experience of working in collaboration and co-design to create the UK Community Sponsorship Programme. This scheme, which many of you will know, allows communities to do what they are best placed to do, to support refugees in building a new life for themselves and their families here in the UK. It is transformative. It's transformative for the refugees and for the communities themselves. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, and you will have heard the incredible stories that people tell about their involvement in it. And you'll have heard about refugees welcomed into a community, now giving back to that community, supporting others during COVID, key workers now in the NHS, or delivering food for neighbours who are isolating. And that for me is true integration, and it takes a whole of society approach to make it happen. So thank you again, Carlos and Isabel. We look forward to digesting further the evidence and recommendations in your report, and in working with you all to ensure that refugees are empowered to thrive here in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. That's really interesting and also very positive, I think, the way that you've described the project and the work that's being done and the evaluation on it. And certainly I know at RAMP and many on the call will be keen to engage with that, and particularly the point that you highlighted about the role of communities and partnerships and how that work, which clearly has been critical. People who come to the UK as refugees have rights, and matching the offer that comes in particular from local authorities around things like housing and education, which is based upon a clear expression of what people's legal rights are, with the offers of support that have come from community organisations and charities, which are extremely welcome, but may not be based upon the same kind of understanding of how people can access that support. There's been, I think, an interesting challenge throughout the Syrian resettlement programme. And clearly the role of local authorities in that context has been hugely, hugely significant. So I think there's definitely a good conversation to be had about how that operates in future. Thank you. So our last panellist, who I'd like to welcome, Fuad, I can see you there. Fuad is going to talk a little bit about his experience, and I'm sure for all the discussion we have about policy and strategy, it's incredibly useful to work out what is actually happening. And I think Fuad is going to be able to shed some light on that question. So Fuad, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very pleased to be sharing the panel with Hannah, who we have been doing a lot of work with the Home Office. Equally, we've done some work with Carlos and Oxford, and good to meet with you, Isabel and Richard, and thanks for your comments. I've read the report and I'm very pleased to see a very thoughtful report coming out about the work actually community housing does. For the last 12, 13 years, we've been working with thousands of refugees from asylum to getting their status to working with them, getting housing, moving on to help them get employed or help them to move into entrepreneurship and actually secure private tenants and move on into a normal life where they are contributing to our society. So this is an area where we have a lot of expertise, and what I wanted to share with you is our work that we are doing on the ground in terms of the 4 themes which the report have spoken about. So very quickly, if I start with the asylum stage, I really agree with all the comments made by Richard and Hannah. There is actually absolutely overhaul. I would say that we need to do our asylum process in the UK. We see day in, day out, people who have just got their status and who have just left nurse accommodation, who come to us after they've been kicked out from their nurse accommodation within 4 weeks to secure accommodation. A lot of these people, as have been said earlier and as been declared in the report, they have actually waited for a very long time to secure their status. The impact of that is a lot of them actually have exacerbated mental health. Already, a lot of them have mental health in terms of how they have left their home country, how they, the war and the civil war that they have seen, where they came from. But actually what adds to is the time and the length that they have to wait to secure their status. Equally, some of the issues that we have seen is the people, the dispersal policy, very well explained again by Richard, have huge impact on people securing employment. A lot of them are placed in areas where there's accommodation available, and rightly so by the Home Office, but that does not fit the economic skills these clients have. And because of that, a lot of them end up not securing jobs. So I think, in essence, there's a lot we can learn from this report, that if we do not have, if we do not review our current asylum process, it will have huge impact on the future integration of the refugees. Once they secure their status and they come to us, usually we give them, well, very quickly we give them housing and we give them support, which starts with basic language skills, which is one of the themes the report speak about. Again, I'm very pleased that Hannah spoke about how ESOL might not necessarily be the right format for teaching English to refugees, and I totally agree with that. One of the things that we actually community housing have seen that works really well is actually giving refugees to language, which is very much linked to the employment that they want to look for. What we really believe in actually community housing is that for actual or a holistic integration model would be somebody to move refugees very quickly into employment, and giving language skills training, which is specifically prepares for them the sector that they want to work with. In other words, sector-specific language training, as well as skills training, actually, would be one of the quickest ways we can actually help. So in essence, the current ESOL model might not necessarily fit that. Speaking about skills training, language training, One thing I would like to add is there's a lot of funding out there, and a lot of these fundings actually are secured by big boys. And what I will wholeheartedly make a case for today is that community organizations, community anchor organizations, people who have the lived experience from the refugee backgrounds, who are working with refugees, need to be funded to make sure refugees get the help they need. What I can tell you with is that some of the work that we've done that really worked well in terms of skills and language training is to actually work with refugees in their own language. And because of that, it actually did help them acquire skills very quickly. So working with community anchor organizations and investing in them will actually yield very good results. If I move on to finally employment and employers, I totally agree. Funding from the government alone is not enough, and in this difficult time, we would suggest thinking how we can engage with the private sector. The work that actually community housing have done with our colleagues include changing the perceptions of what employers think of refugees. If the person from the HR believe hiring refugees only as a charitable case, then it is not enough. We have to see refugees as people who have talent, people who have skills, people who can add to our society and our economy if we give them the opportunity necessary. And only then can we actually help refugees. So working, convincing how we can, our employers, like some of the employers in Germany and in Europe, where major big employers have all made a case of hiring refugees. I think something similar to that would actually really have huge impact on refugee integration. Finally, we're doing a lot of work with entrepreneurship. It is a well-publicized fact that refugees have huge skills in terms of starting their own business. They have taken a lot of risk to come to UK. They are naturally very entrepreneurial, and I think we need to harness that. And one of the and there are a lot of challenges. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but there's a lot of research done. The challenges refugees face in starting their own business. Again, a focused support in the business ecosystem in working with refugees would be really vital here. Funding, which is specifically targeted to work with refugees to help them start businesses, would be good, especially in a time where we actually want to restart our economy. I really believe, like Hannah said, refugees and black ethnic minorities played a big part in the COVID fight. I also believe they can play a big part in restarting our economy. And one of the ways we can do that is to help them get the skills, the funding and the specialist support services that they need. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Fuad. So there's some good questions coming up in the chat. And again, just anybody who wishes to ask a question, if you wave vigorously at the screen, hopefully I or one of my colleagues will catch the fact that you're waving. And alternatively, if you put in the chat, I'll call you. I just wanted to ask a question perhaps to each of you, but maybe starting with something Fuad asked, Fuad raised, which is about how we make sure that the resources that are provided are used in the best way. And for example, ESOL, I know my own experience in a local authority, often the way that was structured originally was not helpful to some of the people who wanted to access it. So having bite-sized programs, for example, delivered before and after school so that mums who were dropping the children off or picking them up could access a 15-minute lesson, organised around the availability of dads who might have been busy looking after their family at certain times, who couldn't access an evening class at a particular fixed time. And even with things like housing, the local authority will provide housing to a refugee family. If they have status, then that will be accessed in the same way as social housing would be for anybody else. Clearly, we need to make sure that people have established and guaranteed access to that if they're to use housing that's offered by charities, voluntary organisations, for example. So where do you think is best to make the decisions about how to use this resource? Is it a local authority thing? Should it be devolved to a community level? Or is it something that should be part of the Home Office's central thinking? Perhaps Fuad, if we start with you based on your community level experience.
Sorry. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, at what level are the decisions best made about how resources are used? So should it be something that's community? Should it be local authority? Should it be by the Home Office at the level, at the national level of the Home Office programme?
I think the partnership approach that have been earlier described is the best way. The partnership approach actually, in my view, usually starts from the government. One of the challenges, David, is each government department in its own right is actually funding each program separately. So I would really call about whether, from the government point of view, whether the DWB, the NHS, the Home Office can actually pull resources together, because helping refugees, get integrated and, and secure employment, not only will it save money for the DWB, but it also saves money for NHS and etc. So I think from the government point of view, the partnership is vital. But also on the ground, I think a partnership approach by community-led organizations, which I said have the expertise, as well as the infrastructure support agencies like the councils and everybody else, and actually the private sector, which is very important, would all be critical.
That's really, really helpful. Just looking at one of the questions that's come in about qualifications, if I may perhaps bring in Richard Fuller, MP. The question being asked about the approach government should take in preparing people for work, and in particular those who come with qualifications that may not be UK recognised. You have a view about that, and then Tony Lloyd, I'll bring you in next.
Well, I don't think there's any way around the recognition of qualifications, if I'm frank. And often I think in the question it's about the medical field, and there's even more reasons why people have a precautionary view about those qualifications. I think the issue is more about the opportunity for people to gain access at the right level of experience that can make up for the fact that those qualifications, that education is not recognized here. And I think in our public services in particular, which, not to make a too broad a point, my personal view is that the labour markets in many of our public services are far more restrictive to talent coming in from outside than is the case in the private sector. Private sector wants talent. One of the great opportunities I think that Hannah was talking about, as the Home Secretary is thinking, is that by having a system for refugees that's open and effective, it will actually benefit the growth of the economy. And so I think I'd say part of that, David, is that for the public services to work out ways in which people with other qualifications in other countries can actually get work experience in the public sector, particularly in the health services. If I could just touch on a couple of things you asked, Fuad. I think I'm really interested in what we've learned in terms of education. So we've talked about ESOL not being developed and delivered effectively. But why can't we have a sort of an online refugee university, so delivered centrally through giving people iPads or some form of tablet device where there is a curriculum that can cover aspects of integration into UK society, people's participation in languages, access to work mentors, rather than leaving it to and I know we use the term lottery too much, but this sort of rather patchy response of what a local authority or others could do.
Thank you.
Could I come in there as well?
Hannah, and then I'll bring in Tony.
Fantastic.
Hannah.
So lots to digest there, right? But I think you asked a question about where should funding decisions be made. And I think there is something here about really understanding at a local level what's happening, and understanding the kind of the matching up. If we accept, as I think we do in the evidence from the report supports, that actually what works is a bespoke, individualized approach, which understands the individual kind of refugee, what their background is, what their aspirations are, what their experience already is. you've got to kind of understand both that individual, but also the kind of the local environment. So what are the local businesses who will be best placed to kind of have that match with that individual? What are the local services? What are the local kind of NGOs kind of operating? And I think some of the learning from the vulnerable person scheme, for example, has been about, you know, devolve the funding really to a local level, but set the framework for what the expectations are. So I think there is definitely more to be done from a central level about what the outcome should be and what the best evidence is about how you deliver those outcomes. And then, Richard, drawing on your point, actually, are there some centralized systems that we should put in place, which means that there is that more of that consistency of approach, which really delivers the outcomes that we all want to see.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Very much in line, actually, with some of the comments in the chat about how that might be achieved with devolved governments, with community partnerships. Recall Tony Lloyd next, and then the question from David Barclay I'm going to put to Isabel and Carlos, which is about the most important lessons learned based on your research. Tony.
Yes, thanks, David, and thanks for what I think has been a very interesting session so far. Let me say, really, almost in the light of Hannah's last remarks, they're music to my ears, and I'm not being unkind when I say in the past the central government has been very numbers driven, very much about delivering a quantity rather than necessarily looking at any quality of outcome, and that's been quite difficult. We've got to move to a position where there is genuine partnership between central government and local agencies, yes, local authorities, but also other local partners who have got something constructive to offer. And building those local partnerships is important, because central government can't deliver the sophistication and the subtlety of service that we need if we're going to make sure that refugees are treated as individuals and not simply as part of that massive numbers game. So it is an appeal. Yes, Hannah, music to my ears, the things you said. I hope that you are being listened to within the Home Office, because the approach that you're taking is the intelligent one, building that national to local partnership, making sure that there is empowerment of people at the local level. But actually, the other thing I would say, we do have to get away from the central government view that it is possible to provide an agency to do these things, because if there's let me say specifically private sector agents, unless they are deliberately working in conjunction with local partnerships, then it doesn't work. It simply is again, it's driven by numbers. Now, final point I would make as well is that the point I think you made, David, early on about the numbers game. The Northwest generally, but actually Greater Manchester and one or two other areas in particular, have taken an enormous amount of pressure from the refugee asylum quantity. We've got to get away from that. There's got to be a better view of how we can make the dispersal work in everybody's interest. That's local communities working with refugees and asylum seekers, rather than it being something that's simply been done centrally. So thanks, Hannah, for your words, very encouraging, and I hope you do win any battles in the Home Office, and do know that there are people there who want to support you. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Tony, and I dare say there will be many in Parliament who will be behind the winning of some of those battles as well, as it definitely needs improvement. Right, so a question really at the heart of that is about best practice, and I'd like to invite our two research experts, Carlos and Isabel, based upon what you've seen in other countries. If you were to extract from those some lessons learned, some particular advice you'd give to the UK of things that should be implemented here, what would you choose? Carlos, Isabel, I can see you both. Isabel, you've got your hand up first.
I'm happy to start because we've been talking about partnerships, and one obvious partnership that I'd like to highlight here is partnership with academia as well, and how to think about interventions, and academics would be very interested on joining efforts on designing interventions and thinking about how to sort of best achieve those outcomes and to be able to evaluate them. So one of the things that, as we were doing the research, that kept sort of speaking to me was this need of a greater also partnership with academia. In terms of better practices, some of the papers on job search for me were quite interesting in that, again, these were some of them partnerships with academia and NGOs or other organizations, and so how to be able to design something that could potentially lead to sort of better labor market outcomes. It's actually achievable. And the process can involve many aspects, such as sort of the messaging and the and helping with aspects of mental health, and sort of raising aspirations and helping with the matching with sort of the local employers. Carlos?
Yes, thank you. For me, the main lesson is also about the need to evaluate policies. So we have been discussing what is the best type of ESOL classes to offer, or who should be taking care of different levels of government of many of these decisions. The idea of piloting policies and evaluating those policies, I think, is very important, because that's the best way of knowing what actually works and what doesn't work, and to what degree policies actually lead to different results. So a big part of the emphasis of us selecting in the report only those policies that were formally evaluated is actually the need to have those evaluations in order to inform policy. If I may add, also one of the questions in the chat also talks about what is the cost efficiency. So interestingly, all these reports and these articles actually make a cost efficiency estimation. So they estimate how much money will it take to have these initiatives in the different countries. Many are pilots, so expanding these initiatives, and versus the revenues that are gained from taxation, from people working, actually generating revenue and depending less on welfare. And in all cases, these policies are cost effective. So the policies have been shown to prove, but also have been shown to be cost effective.
And perhaps a question, if I may, I put this question to Carlos and Isabel. So I spent part of my previous life in the sectoral dialogue in the European Union in the field of education and public services. And I know there was an awful lot of research work that was done on the integration of migrants and refugees into those public services. So working out the kind of skills that were required and then using that as a basis for looking at migration flows. I'm conscious post-Brexit, we're beginning to have that conversation with a wider world. And we hear, for example, the Australian system referred to quite a lot as a model which the UK might wish to consider. I'm really interested in your perspective about what the global academic research might say about any particular points that the UK needs to consider with the implementation of that new policy.
I think I'll leave that question to Carlos.
No, I think that is an important question. It also relates to something that has been said in the chat, which is the differentiation across types of refugees. So not all refugees are the same. Some refugees are highly skilled, and in this, the evidence says that interventions don't make much of a difference for that particular group. So if you have highly skilled refugees, what you need to do is to let them work, right, and integrate into the labor market very quickly. There are other refugees that need some assistance, right, to integrate and to know the labor market. So I would say one big lesson across the world will be to take into account also the heterogeneity of refugees. Something that Hannah was also mentioning was that in the UK we are resettling refugees across many different locations, and that's correct. But we are not trying to match people given their skills to the needs of that location. So there could be more strategic matching, and that requires also looking at the heterogeneity across refugees. So I would say that in general, that would be an important lesson that we can see from across the world.
That's a very, very useful thing for us to think about. Now, look, time is against us. We have 3 minutes left, and we've had quite a lot of interesting points that have been raised in what I think has been a really rich panel discussion, ranging from some things that are very practical, like the way in which language learning is delivered, basic things that are required for access to work, through to some really interesting points from Hannah about the work that the Home Office is doing and where that might lead. some really, I think, helpful insights from Richard, particularly on the points around qualifications and the political reality check that all of these things need to go through. And then, of course, from Carlos and Isabel about what the international research demonstrates. Now, I think we all know just from our own experience, there are bodies out there like the OECD that are doing huge amounts of research about the economic impact of migration and how the different policies which governments have and different authorities have really impacts on that and what that means at individual national level. And particularly with the debate both about safe and legal routes and the debate about what the new points-based immigration system looks like. It's a really timely moment to be having that conversation. So I would like to finish up really by saying thank you so much to everybody who's joined this evening and who's made a contribution. Thank you in particular to our panelists. Time, as I say, is short, but this is something which clearly is the start of a much longer conversation rather than the end of one. And particular thanks to Will in my office and Ramp for the work that's been put into organising the event and getting everybody along this evening. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That brings this meeting to a close.